Greetings, everybody. Hey, so Jess Romero here. Hey, so I'm going to discuss this topic for this week about the discussion on the problem of scale and how it factors into a government's ability to effectively operate and meet the needs of its population. So, with that, I want to bring attention to Dr. Livingston's lecture, the two-part lecture that we had this week. I found it to be rather fascinating, intriguing, and full of a lot of information, and actually covering some of the things that I've been going over this semester myself. In that, the concept of he brings up the topic of government scale in relation to monarchy and republicanism, which is actually rather fascinating because of my thesis paper for this class was about Tacitus's views on monarchy and liberty. And what's interesting about that is that what he discusses about Hobbes is that Hobbes believed that as a society, he thought that it was important that society give up some of their liberty in a sense to a sovereign, i.e., such as a monarch, and it was the monarch's responsibility in a social contract, if you will, to maintain, if you will, order, and that this monarch even had authority over both the civic spheres as well as the church spheres in a sense. And so I found that rather fascinating, interesting, especially in light of my reading of Plato and Aristotle, who both discuss things and as well with regard to the concept of smaller limited government in a sense. They were not supporters of democracy, neither of them. Neither was Marcellus of Padula or Tacitus. Tacitus had an interest in republicanism, though he was born decades after the fall of the Roman Republic, as well as Immanuel Kant, who I've also been reading about. He also did not agree with democracy and thought it was to be pretty detrimental to liberty, ultimately. And so, in discussing Tacitus's views, for example, Tacitus he examined the reasons for the fall, say, the Roman Republic, and why it fell and became the empire, the Principatus, if you will, of the imperium of the Emperor of Rome. And, well, from what I've gleaned, a lot of the times republicanism becomes so big, so encompassing, in which it's not supposed to, as Dr. Livingston discussed in his video, that republicanism really was meant to be very small, very limited government in a sense. And so when you get a lot of people, more people involved, you tend to get more voices, more minds, more discussions, more controversies, more arguments, more vitriol, and thus you get bigger, more problems. And that's what happened to the Roman Republic, and that's what's happening to, say, our republic. Unfortunately, our republic, most Americans don't even understand that our republic or that we're even supposed to be a republic. Most people see us as a democracy. Well, when you read Plato and Aristotle's own writings, they detail that democracy is pretty bad, and it's pretty detrimental, and actually leads to tyranny, if you will. Both Aristotle and Plato discuss things such as the natural slave, and in their belief, natural slaves shouldn't have a position in the governing body because, well, they are, as Dr. Livingston discussed about, enslaved to the natural base mind and behaviors which the rule of law is supposed to restrain in a civilized society. Unfortunately, as we found with the Athens' republic, as well as Rome's republic, even though there were established rules of law under these republican systems, republicanism historically fails every time. And one of the primary means of republicanism failing and collapsing is what we're witnessing in the United States today, and that is democracy. And with democracy, you have mobcracy rule, mob rule, as Plato, Aristotle talked about. And thus you tend to have, as Tacitus discussed in the fall of the Roman Republic, you tend to get greater and greater vitriol until you have aggression and violence, such as happened in the first civil war between Marius and Sulla, which most people don't recall how violent that was. You know, everybody knows about Caesar being stabbed to death in the Roman Senate, but the first Civil War was actually in many ways a lot more violent, with the beheading of senators and even the consul of Rome, who was a friend of Sulla, and their heads being placed in the Forum, which is pretty grim. But that is republicanism failing, thus the rule of law under republicanism. And so, for example, going back to Tacitus's understanding view, he believed that he believed in the monarchy, and he believed in the monarchy of the imperium of the emperor, and thus he wanted to safeguard the power of the monarchy of Rome. And what's interesting is Theodore Mommsen, who was one of the most proficient and greatest historians of ancient Roman history, he said this about Tacitus with regard to monarchy. He said, Tacitus is a monarchist, but from necessity, one could say from despair. And what he meant by that is that he understood what Tacitus understood, is that, unfortunately, because the rule of law is weakened by the human nature, i.e. what the Bible says, it says that the law was weakened by, sinful nature of man. The law was weak. Thus, in Hebrews chapter 7, it even says, for the law was weak, it was useless, it could not do anything. Thus, a greater hope was brought through Christ. And so, law in itself cannot maintain that which is not in the human heart. It's meant to restrain people, and for a time it does sometimes. But when people abandon virtue, when they abandon the belief in right and wrong, these virtues, these things that we hold dear, that are the building blocks of civilization that began in ancient Babylon under King Hammurabi and the prior kings, then society begins to collapse and you get problems. And thus, Tacitus believed in the concept of monarchy, the monarch, the sovereign, which the Bible talks about, in which, Christ is referred to as King of Kings with a capital K. You go back to Daniel when he was in Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar was called King of Kings with a lower K for the first king. And many other kings after him were called King of Kings, and that's because Elohim, the Most High, granted this authority to Nebuchadnezzar over the entire earth as King of Kings. Lower K emphasis. And so, in closing, I would say that the problem of this is we look at our modern republic that we are. Well, we're not really. And you look to the Article 4, Section 4 of the United States Constitution, and the founders intended us to be a republic, if that's what it says, and for the executive to protect all states and to guarantee all states a Republican form of government and to protect them from invasion. Well, that's not what's happening. We've turned into a democracy, which Plato, Aristotle, and many others says will lead to tyranny because it will collapse. And so ultimately, we're either going to have a tyrant or we're going to have a monarch. And as Hobbs discussed, as Marcellus of Padua, Kant, and many others, as well as Tacitus, they believed that ultimately a monarch was the strongest, most firm governing person in order to maintain peace and order, ultimately. But yes, you do have to give up some of your liberty in a sense, but you do get some sense of order. And so I think the belief is, and the hope is, that you get a monarch instead of a tyrant. And not just a monarch, but as Aristotle said in one of his famous quotes, that you get a monarch, a king, who is also a philosopher, and a philosopher of peace and hope and truth. Thank you, Justin Merrill. Take care. God bless.